another PC game before I return to games that drain batteries. The next video will be about a Vita game, so don't leave. The Vita can't fail, right? One day in 1993, some people decided to make a game about shooting demons in first person, and the world was changed forever. Then other people copied the same formula over and over and over. And we got lots of good games from that, but nothing felt like the next leap the industry needed. Games were just like Doom, but nothing, not even the actual sequel to Doom, pushed the industry further. And then Duke Nukem shook up the landscape, his third game traded in platforming for first-person shooting in believable worlds that made the most of the verticality they could. This was like nothing that came before, and it was immediately robbed of being a technological marvel because then Quake showed up and used actual polygons. It's easy to forget that Duke 3D was only the king for 6 months, because a lot of games used the same engine, and some of them were actually good, just not the majority. But the best of these, in my opinion, the best to me subjectively, is Blood, the 1997 Monolith developed shooter, which also has a bad name to search for because just look up Blood on a search engine, it's not very helpful. This is from the same studio that would eventually go on to make great games like Aliens vs Predator 2, Condemned, Fear, and in recent years have been making games I don't care about, but that's okay. I frankly already have too much on my backlog, so please keep making games that aren't for me, so I can finally get all this done and go outside again. Blood feels like a more polished and fun version of the also amazing Duke 3D, and given the year of time separating them, it's easy to see why. We even have some voxels here, and Duke wish he had those. I am also obligated to mention Shadow Warrior since I mentioned the other two Society-approved 90s build engine games. Shadow Warrior existed. Now for this specific video, I primarily played the modern re-release on Steam, Blood Fresh Supply. Since this is the easiest to access and most readily available version of the game, even if it technically isn't the same as the original as some purists only want the most faithful version possible. If you want that and want it to be significantly more challenging because of limited controls, there is a homebrew version on the Vita, and boy is that an experience. And if you want that game, but to have it actually be good, play any of the PC versions like N-Blood and Blood GDX. They are also great avenues to play this game. In fact, fan builds will be inherently better to most people, since they can continue to be updated, but this official version can't due to the publisher Atari not letting the devs fix further issues. But I like N-Blood and GDX too, I promise. But this is just a preamble to cover myself, since 90s shooter fans get mad if you don't play the exact version they play. But look, here I am playing Duke 3D on the Vita. And here I am on the Switch, enjoying the new levels from the cursed Randy Pitchford version. And look, here I am playing Shadow Warrior on mute because I don't like racism. But hey, I still enjoy this commercially released version, because Blood is always good. Plus, Fresh Supply has a lot of nice options, including an adjustable field of view, fully customizable difficulty option, and this neat weapon wheel menu so I can quickly scroll through weapons without having to see Caleb arm himself. This new version comes from Night Dive Studios, who have made a name for themselves handling old 90s shooters on modern systems, with some standout examples being Doom 64 and Quake. And thanks to Atari's meddling, this likely will never be ported off PC, so unlike Night Dive's other works, I won't be able to buy this game twice, just to have it playable in bed. But I'm sure that's a good thing since my wallet is not infinite. But what makes Blood a game worth buying multiple times? Well, to me, this is quite possibly my favourite first-person shooter ever, and it feels like a true perfection of what the industry was building up to in the mid to late 90s. And with very few exceptions, we don't have the annoying button-pressing puzzles of Duke 3D that would slow the game to a crawl if you don't dedicate an entire part of your brain to remembering them. Nor are the levels the same kinds of confusing mazes you would quite often see back then. This just feels like a masterclass of the genre. In terms of layout, these levels are a cut above what was there at the time, and they still rise above many modern templates. Not every level is perfect, but most of these are old textbook examples in being open environments that still somehow funnel the player with easy to find keys to segment everything. Secrets are never made too obvious, they're still secrets after all, but they are easier to stumble upon than quite a few other games, and since exploration is encouraged here, with lots of things like split pathways that all ultimately lead back to each other, it never ceases to be fun to explore and you're rewarded for doing so. An example of those split pathways leading back to each other is in E3M1, when you can take the elevator to get to the top floor,
Elevator's busted.
or you can go through the building's lobby first on the bottom floor. Either way, you'll be clearing out the entire building, but you get to change the order of events depending on how you feel like it. E2M4 has you in a hotel lobby with all kinds of pathways immediately available, and they can be tackled in any order, plus as many secret passageways between the walls. In some levels, you'll be finding a total of 6 keys, and this helps make sure everything is broken up efficiently and you don't have to backtrack through an entire level just the small section that you're in. The levels never feel linear, even when they are funneling you to go a specific order. Even the super linear train level early on still manages to have alternate routes and exploration, which is just a wonderful thing. This is like a small playground of blood and viscera between locked doors, but imagine a less horrifying analogy. The game never really devolves into mazes or huge open environments where you don't know which section is the way forward. Even the literal hedge maze sections aren't confusing mazes. For the most part, the intent of the game is to overwhelm you with enemies, and not to make you feel like a lab rat in a maze. Outside of levels like aqueducts, but we don't talk about that one. The game starts with a CG cutscene that is, well, a cute attempt, I say decades later, and our protagonist Caleb sees his friends being taken away by the demonic deity they all follow, and then this being, Chernobog, kills Caleb. Episode 1 is a great introduction, though the opening seconds aren't, since you'll be limited to a pitchfork, and the very early weapons you get like dynamite and a flare gun start off with very limited ammo. And yes, our first gun shoots fire, and this sticks to enemies. Or if it's alt fire, it destroys entire hordes of them. Alternate fire is a core part of this game's feeling and identity, and it makes the already large arsenal feel like it's double its size. And it's worth remembering how uncommon this was back in 1997. Early on, the game was trying to make sure you properly understand how to throw the dynamite and how to set things on fire, because learning those is half the game. The other half is learning which buttons are quick save and quick load. Later weapons do become your workhorses, in particular the shotgun, which is my favourite to ever grace a video game. Sorry Doom 2, you just get second place. This shotgun fires quickly, and with its alt fire it fires 2 shots together, and since Caleb has superhuman gun reloading powers, this is a destructive force and is the go-to weapon for anything you're not saving the more powerful toys for. The trio of dynamite, flare gun, and shotgun define the early game, and best of all, they never become redundant. You get later more powerful weapons, but they're there for when you need them. And you will need them, but basic enemies, even the mid-rank ones, are no match for this trio. Also there's a Tommy gun. It's cool, I like it, especially the animation on its alt fire, but it is the most boring weapon here unfortunately. But that is saying a lot because in any other game, this super fast demon slaying machine gun would be near the top. And this is still a nice workhorse and it's great for hordes of enemies you'd rather not set on fire or explode. But get to know how to use all these weapons efficiently, because episode 1 is not messing around. Starting by exiting his own grave,
I live again.
Caleb's personality will be on full display. He talks, not as much as Duke, but enough to leave us wanting more, and his quotes are the right level of cheese, and his angsty, edgy voice carries these performances.
I'm gonna paint the town red. Here's Johnny. I'm here to donate some blood. Someone else's.
And his reflection fits this voice to a T. Immediately this game's atmosphere makes itself apparent. This is an incredibly rich one, and it helps immerse yourself into this weird world with chunky environments and flat enemy sprites. I wouldn't call this a horror game, but it's definitely horror themed, like the old Castlevanias, which embrace the imagery but aren't there to frighten the player. The environs are all smothered in this aesthetic, yet they each manage to feel incredibly distinct from each other, even with very limited and dreary colours which manage to perfectly balance the tightrope of being atmospherically muted without being boring and samey. And how could they be samey? We start at a cemetery complete with a funeral home, then make our way to a nearby train station complete with shops and places to eat, and this is just the first 2 levels. These 2 are simply laid out spectacles that are fun to explore and immerse yourself in, but good luck with the early enemies. It's mostly hit-scanning cultists who on occasion throw explosives at you, but hey, in a nice attention to detail, they too can abuse the ability to duck and move around while shrinking their vulnerability range. Compared to other games back then, they really do feel like combat geniuses for not just standing around awkwardly, they're just as evil as you, the player, even if that does make things more annoying sometimes. The upside is some dead enemies drop health in what this game calls life essence, so it's in your best interest to kill as much as you can, and these will serve as a reward for going through tough encounters. These are primarily how you'll heal yourself, though there is a portable medkit here too, which works as you'd expect. Other items debut in this opening episode like the jumping boots. These let you explore much more vertically and let you find secrets or even sequence break a little, but it is much more restrictive than something like Duke Nukem's jetpack, since it doesn't feel like you're breaking things in half anymore. After the train station, we board the train, which is a fun level in its own right, and then we crash this train at the Carnival. And this is when the game's 1920s-esque time period is on full display here. Even though this is ultimately a simple layout, I can't help but love my time here. It even rewards you for kicking the enemy heads. I love my time here, which is good because the first secret level doubles down on this theme, before Blood Episode 1 gives up its whimsy and embraces more dramatic temple locations to close up the act. I mean, they're still good, they're classically gothic, but Blood Episode 1 is really here to make a great first impression first and foremost, but it does stumble a bit where it matters less. If you made it that far, you're already invested. As a whole, this was a nice sampler platter of the full game, as any good shareware was. And one of the hallmarks of a game was undeniably made here: its music. At this point, it's still novel and frankly amazing. It's atmospheric, first and foremost, but it really is a series of haunting compositions that would sound great on a variety of sound hardware, since the 90s was the Wild West of PC sound. Though the only real issue is it isn't enough of it. But hey, that's a problem for later on. In episode 1, this is still great. Yet despite that great first impression, the next episodes are where the core game peaks for me. Episodes 2, 3, and yes, even 4 are a huge step up from episode 1, and this is where the game really starts to let you off its leash and give you a wider variety of weapons to defeat significantly more enemies across some of the best levels the genre has ever had, as well as a few that let's not talk about. Straight up, this trio of episodes each have at least one dud in them, usually at the end. These episodes are less bombastic, featuring more down-to-earth environments, but they're still so expertly designed I won't complain. Except for when they're not, and then I will complain, looking at you the end of episode 3. Episode 2 is my favourite of these, and it manages to look nothing like what came before. These levels are set in a frozen, snowy landscape with ice littering everything, and plenty of water to swim through, which means we're finally introduced to the guild beasts, who are beasts in the water, but well, on land they're kind of embarrassing. The swimming here adds much more depth and movement options to the overall game. Unfortunately, the swimming itself isn't as ideal as it could be. Running low on breath darkens the screen before leaving you dead, which is say fine in level 1, but some later levels are in some underwater flooded labyrinths, and I just need to see ahead so I can know when to surface. And the game tries to mitigate this with a scuba suit, but it is so useless it's almost a joke. It ticks down really quickly and it can't be toggled on and off, but hey, at least we have a fancy voxel for it. Oh yeah, Fresh Supply added a lot of voxels to this game which are nice to look at and can be turned off if you want things to be more classic. I prefer them, except sometimes things get weird like the camera clips into the voxel space since the collision is still based on it being a flat object. But hey, that's just a feature. And an actual feature in Fresh Supply, which is a godsend for me personally, is the multiple power-ups we get here like invincibility or dual wielding, sorry, I meant to say the much cooler guns akimbo, now have a timer displaying how long until it's all up. This is important since you don't want your invincibility or reflective abilities to run out in the worst possible location. Back onto episode 2, this will make sure that you never forget spiders, which are here all the time just to mess up your vision, but hey, at least it's a kind of novel thing to see, but get used to that because the spiders are not going anywhere. As a whole, episode 2 quickly ratchets up the intensity, and more weapons are either introduced here, or made much more apparent and given so much more ammo that they feel like they were introduced here, even if they technically weren't, like the napalm launcher, which does what it says on the tin. This is an overpowered beast, with its only downside being it can take you down too if you're not careful. And we can't forget about the aerosol can, even if I wrote an entire first draft of the script without mentioning it. We can light enemies on fire up close, or use its alternate fire to throw it like a fiery grenade. And the least impressive of these new weapons here just happens to be the one I'd rather not talk about, because Voodoo has a bad enough public perception thanks to bad representation, so I'll just say oof and leave it there for this problematic weapon. I look forward to not reading the comments. Despite that, it's so great being in episode 2, we've traded in the intense browns and warm colours for a much cooler palette. And these locales are perfectly suited to this. We have things like a lumber mill or hotel. These aren't over the top ideas anymore. They all lend themselves to this game's mechanics, and each transition wonderfully to each other, even if it's more subtle things like ending at a gate and the next level is just on the other side of that same gate. Sorry, we're not crashing a train here. Unfortunately, episode 3 can't compete with 2's greatness, but it does get really close with some of my favourite stages like Ghost Town, The Siege, and my personal favourite of the entire episode, The Sick Ward. At its best, these levels are more urban city levels, but unfortunately we also spend too long in sewers or other underground locations which make things look a bit too samey. This is made even worse with the game adding a terrible puzzle section that has to be completed to progress a single level, although it can be circumvented in Fresh Supply due to this new engine not quite understanding how physics work. At least it means we won't be crushed to death by these crusher segments anymore. Despite a mixed bag of level aesthetics and the fun being lesser during these more drab levels, due to them sometimes being a bit more slow paced, this episode is when everything really does click in terms of combat. We have all the prior enemies, including things I didn't even bother to go into, like the hands or the ghosts that spice things up and best of all aren't annoying hit scanners. But we also get the little fire-breathing doggies that, while more challenging, are easy to take down since Serious Sam has made me an expert in the field of just holding down the S key constantly. But when you're in a room full of them and other enemies firing from a distance, it does become a fun joy to navigate. On a mechanical level, this is probably the peak since the devs love going overboard later, but overall this level is short and sweet, with some of the highest highs for me, but also the lowest lows in the main game. Good thing episode 4 is here to somewhat pick up the slack. Though I say somewhat because this is the precursor to the kinds of levels that just go overboard and are filled with enemy spam. Though these levels themselves thankfully aren't that level of hell, but we do go to actual hell so it does work out. This episode's kind of split into two halves here. First of these feels more classically Blood, with environments that play on gothic horror and references to modern day film horror. And then the second half kind of throws that away to begin its descent into hell, which is some nice visual variety even if it's not what I'm here for. The midpoint is where for me personally this episode peaks, though even at its worst I still prefer this episode to the first and the expansions coming up shortly. Crystal Lake has us explore a scary forest, which is surprisingly new for this game, even if it feels like a match made in heaven, which probably explains why so many fan additions to this game use this aesthetic. And before this theme risks becoming overdone, we either go straight to hell, or to my favourite secret level in the main game, Mall of the Dead. Secret levels in this game are all fun to reach, and they never feel like weird, poorly implemented multiplayer levels. These are all deviously hidden, and this one is no exception. But if you dare to go here, you'll get a really out of place shopping mall with some clear health and safety violations. But who cares, it's a mall and it looks cool. More shooters need more levels, and this level is where you'd perhaps notice the fact that the game is starting to overwhelm you a bit with enemies. And yeah, that's normal, the secret levels are always the hardest in the episodes, even if they're in the middle. But unlike previous episodes, things still stay intense once this level is over and we're back on the main path. At least the life leech is here to make things easier. This is such a great tool for hordes, and this game's constant boss repeats, which I'll explain in a second. Despite the name, this doesn't leech life from enemies and give it to you, at least not in the updated version starting with Plasma Pack back in October 1997. It's just a powerful weapon that when it's out of ammo, can still be used at the cost of your own life. Cool. But the Plasma Pack gave this an alt fire, where it just stands there and acts as a turret to deal with everything surrounding it. You can get rid of the mother spiders, and this is good because these last few maps love bringing back old bosses we already fought before. Episode 1 had a giant stone gargoyle who has made the rounds a lot by this point. Episode 2 ended with a mother spider who constantly gave birth to more baby spiders to get you, and this is starting to become part of the usual rotation by the end of episode 4. Episode 3 had a big two-headed puppy who you cannot pet unfortunately, and he does reappear here, but thankfully not to the same extent. And each of those were intimidating in their own right, so get used to fighting them while in smaller, tighter rooms that aren't the cool boss arenas of before, and also enjoy it while there's other enemies draining your health from the sidelines. The bosses all escalated in challenge, which is why this game's actual end boss is so disappointing. The big bad you've been here to get since the opening cutscene is no challenge at all. Oh well, because even when it's over, it's not actually over. Blood had two separate expansions, one from Monolith themselves and the other from Sunstorm Interactive, a company that made a name for themselves with officially licensed add-on packs for games like Redneck Rampage, Shadow Warrior, and obviously Duke Nukem 3D. This company put out Duke It Out in DC and Duke Caribbean Life's a Beach, content well worth playing, so please get into your time machine to buy the Megaton edition before Gearbox removed it from digital marketplaces in 2016. I should probably start with Sunstorm's edition, Cryptic Passage, since it was both released and set before Monolith's edition, but that's not how I played it, so Monolith's expansion post-mortem it is. First impressions are nice. We have a more urban setting with map 1 being a department store, map 2 being another shopping center, and even the third level's more drab cargo storage facility is getting high marks from me. This is what I want. But then you play the levels and well, they're still good, especially early on, but they are a noticeable step down from what came before. Things have ramped up and it's more challenging than what was already a hard game, but at least there are some new enemies in this expansion, which I'm always a fan of even when they annoy me, like these plants that essentially shoot napalm at you. Thanks. At least we have new cultists here which I enjoy even if they're more deadly than the other ones in terms of raw firepower, because they do moves I can actually dodge. These rogues recolors either throw TNT only if they're green, or shoot a Tesla cannon at you when blue. Not fun to be on the receiving end of, but at least it's better than being on the receiving end of a bunch of tiny Calebs. Sure, they're easy to kill, but they love coming out of nowhere to surprise you to get some cheap shots in. And cheap shots is kind of the name of the game here. This expansion, essentially episode 6, except to me who played them out of order, is full-on enemy spam and environments generally here to make you lose health. Everything is thrown at you, which is understandable since this is an expansion pack and it needs to up the challenge from before, especially since this was primarily for devoted fans who are the kinds of people that would buy this, and most wouldn't even care about it. I will say I do like this episode. I seem to like it more than most from what I've seen. I really enjoy about half the levels here, and the other half aren't bad, they're just a bit more forgettable. Except for the one level that is bad, but I really do not want to get into aqueducts. I'm sorry if that's your favourite level. On the bright side, the final boss here isn't as bad as episode 4's, even if that isn't a particularly high bar. And then if you're like me, you go from episode 6 to episode 5, because it's easier to do that in Fresh Supply, since the Sunstorm expansion is listed under add-ons instead of in the main menu of the actual episode list. We'd not recommend this order since episode 6 is the game at its hardest, officially at least, and episode 5 here isn't. In fact, this is probably the easiest episode of all, since it almost exclusively sticks to early enemies but gives you ammo for late game guns. At the risk of losing whoever is still watching, I don't really care for Cryptic Passage. The levels are less intuitive, and most of the enemies we have here are just hit scanners, and since this predates the episode I just mentioned, we don't even get the other cultist varieties to help spice up the enemy roster. That being said, environmentally speaking, this is second to none in the game. These are some of the most interesting and pretty levels in Blood. Each feels so distinct, and yet they all link up incredibly wonderfully, with great attention to detail to how the secret level is implemented in this. And we go from the docks to a castle in the top of the mountains, and it all links so wonderfully that I don't question this. Unfortunately, this wonderful atmosphere and level variety don't make up for the poor roster of enemies and the overpowered weapons we have to kill them. Sorry Sunstorm, I like your work a lot, it's just that this is the weakest of a great bunch of episodes. Part of this is that these levels don't really feel like Blood, or at least the good ones. Keys are more hidden, and the focus is more so on interacting with buttons to find keys, and then once you do that the enemies spawn right there just to get you. But even when it doesn't feel like Blood, it can still be great. There are some truly great levels in Cryptic Passage, it's just that they could have been improved much more by tightening things like the enemy count. The boat docks is a fun introduction, the opera house is wonderful and does the best job of feeling lived in and believable. The monastery was the surprise hit with more variety and better enemy placement than I expected, and the following level, the steamboat, is a small and claustrophobic level that is the perfect size for what it expects of you. But the other half is just not very fun for me personally, with particular lowlights going to Mountain Pass, which is the most boring level in the entire game, and the secret level Boggy Creek being the weakest secret level in all of Blood. But hey, the final level here, the castle, is more than worth the lesser levels. This is my favourite end of episode location. It throws everything at you, but is still paced excellently and doesn't cross the line the way episode 6 did. These two expansions are both good in their own right, and I don't want to sell them short, even if the consistency is lower than that of the main game. But they're both worth it for the enjoyable parts, just maybe don't play all 6 episodes back to back like I did for the sake of a video. These were meant to be released once apart after all, and it's probably best experienced that way. This is Blood for when you don't want to play the main Blood, so even if it's a relatively disappointing ending to this excellent game, it is still a great send-off. But like I said earlier, even when it's over, it's not actually over. Not surprisingly, this popular 1990s shooter has an active modding community, and since this is on the more obscure end of good 90s shooters, there are way less mediocre or well-intended but poorly made first attempts of modding in this community. We have mods for everything, but of course the ones that matter the most to most people are level packs, and these come in both simple singular or small chunk level varieties and full episode expansions, and they're all great. I'm boring, so I'll play Duke Nukem 3D levels again in this same engine, but there's more than just recycling here. This is a whole ocean of unofficial expansions that are each worth playing if this game is your jam. These are all excellent, and even at the worst they're still more than good enough to be up there with the authorized official expansions, because even Duke Nuclear Winter was official and that was terrible, and these are all better than terrible. Yet one mod in particular rises above the rest, the cliche one that I hadn't played before now, and I figured it would be good but not deserving of a whole section. But then I played it and I was instantly proven wrong. Death Wish is a labour of love, and even when I say bad things about it, and I will, it needs to be stated that on a technical level, this pushes the build engine beyond what should be its limits. And every level, even the ones I don't love, are all memorable and clearly made by someone who not only gets the appeal of blood, they love and cherish this game. I'm assuming, maybe they actually hated and this is all a funny joke. But since a 4th episode is seemingly in development, I'm sure it's not. And yes, in episode 4, this is already a 3-episode expansion, which basically makes it its own game. And to many, this is seen as the real continuation of Blood, with these affectionately being called episodes 7, 8, and 9. That's how remarkable this fan effort is. Included here are some of the best levels in the entire game, and it carries the title of Blood sequel better than the actual Blood sequel, which I keep hearing is raw. This is like one of those moments where you like a game and it gets a disappointing sequel, and then you assume the series is kind of dead, until years later, a new game not only emerges to match your expectations, it exceeds them. First of all, we have cutscenes here that are not awful byproducts of the mid-90s, so that's a good start. And these are the only truly new things here, by which I mean everything in these beautiful, varied levels of effects everywhere, and seemingly new mechanics, are all just built on Blood's core files, textures, and so on. The only caveat is some of this is stuff that was cut from the main game, but remnants of it can still be found in the files if you go digging. This includes all the new to us power-ups, like the asbestos armor to keep you safe from fire, and the featherfall item which lets you fall slowly and avoid taking damage. Plus we even have a 7th key to worry about. That's what we use to open up secret levels in this mod. And it's worth reiterating, this mod is such a big deal that Fresh Supply gives these items voxels. These are things that would not be seen in the core released game, and they still went to the effort to do that because they knew this expansion was popular. The only other caveat with everything being in the files here is the music. There is an optional new soundtrack that can be downloaded and it's great. Thank you Speedy for these compositions. They were not only a breath of fresh air after playing the 6 episodes earlier, but these all absolutely fit Death Wish's specific aesthetics and match the style of Blood to a T. Okay, that's enough preamble. Within the first map alone, we see more creativity than entire episodes had, and it continues to escalate. Map 2 is even more extravagant, then Map 3 tops that, and it just keeps going until it eventually has to plateau. Every level, especially early on, feels like a moment that the designer wanted to push themselves to do, just so we could have a more memorable moment than what came before. We have vehicles crash and explode, the floor disappear from under you, and multiple sections where we set off an explosive and have to run away from it like a cool guy in an action movie. One such example even has us leap out of the building onto a nearby one for safety. This isn't the same Blood of before. It's much more focused on storytelling and set pieces, with the former being done through environmental storytelling, as well as textbooks that we can pick up and read that are thankfully very concise and don't mess with the flow. But it's worth reading them if you want an easier time with secrets, and to properly understand the exact reason why the game decided to do an annoying jump scare on you. Yeah, wasn't a fan of those. At least the levels know how to heavily limit the best weapons and items. You need to work hard for the privilege of spamming napalm. And this, along with all the other enemies from the official expansion, result in the most tense and frankly fun enemy encounters in all of Blood. And that's not even touching on the level design, which is second to none, except for all the levels I personally don't care for, but I don't want to be a downer. I just need to rave about how cool all these levels were. We have a level based on Alien, which occurs after the previous level ended with us launching into space, and this level set on the Monstromo puts the hand enemies to their best use. And then after another cool explosive set piece where we have to run into an escape pod, we get a level based on the sequel Aliens. Well, you do if you got the secret level. And this really pushes the limited assets to their limits. They turned the annoying plants into xenomorph eggs, and the fleshy hell walls coat the nest. And after most secret levels, we even backtrack through a smaller version of the level preceding it, just so we can properly go to the main level that would normally follow. And this isn't just lazy copy-pasting, things have been changed dramatically, especially in the visuals, and sometimes they like to throw Cerberus in there. But hey, that means I get to revisit the best level of this whole expansion, Bogey Beach. This level has a boardwalk, a moving vehicle, skee ball, demonic hell beasts, and a hotel section that breaks apart into whatever this is, and you're telling me the game lets me come back to it but it's all snowy? This is the best mod that's ever been made. Keep it coming. We even have another amusement park level that doesn't at all feel repetitive, despite the main game featuring 2 back-to-back in the first episode. This one is a more modern park, thanks to this mod presumably being set in the relatively recent history, given the computers and TVs, and this makes the absolute most of this theme by making us go through things like a river ride, a theatre, and a haunted house, and so much more. This feels much more like the Duke 3D amusement park levels in its expansions, and I mean that as a compliment. Even if it's so good here, it makes Babeland and Mr. Splashy just look like early proofs of concept in comparison. Also, just while I'm praising this mod, it has a level based on Silent Hill, and then it goes straight into a level taking heavy influence from Silent Hill 4. I don't have a follow-up, that's just cool. What isn't cool is the darkness. Sometimes it is, like when the light shines through to illuminate something beautifully through this limited engine. But then it just goes so dark and it turns into Doom 64. That joke would be funnier if we didn't live in an era where most people who played Doom 64 knew it through the Night Dive version, which fixed the darkness issue. Hey, but I'm sure there are some 30-somethings out there that laughed at that joke before their bones started to hurt. I could really just describe all the cool levels in Death Wish, and I almost want to, but I'd regret doing it during the editing process, so I'll cut it here and just say that these levels are all so creative and I want more of them. It has mechanics I love, like jumping over incessant projectiles, and just being cruel with twists that make me regret not dropping a quick save anytime recently. But hey, I can't be mad at the giant puppy. Blood was originally a 4-episode game that was the peak of the genre for me. Then it was expanded into a 6-episode game that was even richer for its new content, even if it wasn't as consistent as before. And thanks to this fan mod, we now have a 9-episode game that is truly a masterpiece, and I hope to see that increase to 10 episodes as is currently planned. The only thing even as important as that is Fresh Supply's single greatest addition to this landmark title. We now have 8-player split-screen local co-op. We can all huddle around the same keyboard and play. And if you don't have friends but want to simulate it, you can just play the entire thing in the tiny corner of a screen. This is truly the game that keeps on giving.